Hello and welcome to Nashville Public Television screening of The Black Church. This is our story, this is our song, a new docuseries by Dr. Henry Louis Gates. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm LaTanya Turner, producer at NPT, and I'll be leading the discussion tonight about the video clips you're going to be watching, as well as a discussion about the Black Church in Nashville and Tennessee. And joining me are some very special guests who know all about that. First, Reverend Judy Cummings, a public justice theologian and retired pastor of New Covenant Christian Church here in Nashville. Dr. Dennis Dickerson, professor of African American religious history at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Carol Van West, Tennessee State historian and director of the Center for Historic Preservation at MTSU. And Dr. Stephen Lewis, curator of the Nashville National Museum of African American Music, or NAMAM as we fondly call it, here in Nashville, now open to the public. Yay. Thank you all for joining us. You can see more about our guests in their bios that you can find in the speakers section below the video that you're watching right now. And you can ask questions and comment as well in the right-hand panel at any time during this event. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. One final note, if there's a slight delay between the discussion and the video, don't worry, that's part of the process. We'll let you know in the chat section if there are any major problems. Now, here's a bit more information about Ovi, and then immediately following that, we'll watch clips from the Black Church. This is our story, this is our song. Stay tuned. Let the church say amen. Right? We have a lot to talk about, so we're going to stop the video and take a moment to discuss what you've just seen and also to talk about what was happening in Nashville and Tennessee with the Black Church. This is a great time to look at our early history, and we have a rich cultural history here in Nashville with African American culture as well as religion. Some of the earliest churches in the country were formed right here. I'm going to ask Dr. Dickerson to tell us a little bit about what was happening in Nashville and Tennessee in the 1800s, in those earliest days of the Black church formation. Dr. Dickerson?
In the antebellum period, there were a number of Black congregations throughout the South. They were situated in Richmond, in Savannah, in Charleston, in New Orleans, in Louisville, and they were Baptists, they were African Methodist Episcopal, some were Episcopal churches, but they were congregations that derived from original white congregations where African Americans desired to worship among themselves. Nashville was no different. In the early 1820s, an African mission was established at the old McKendree Methodist Episcopal Church. And they requested, the African Americans requested on their own to have a separate worship site. And that African mission evolved eventually into what became the Capers Memorial Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, later Christian Methodist Episcopal. Another antebellum congregation which flowered and which blossomed was the first Colored Baptist Mission. African Americans who originally worshiped with the white First Baptist Church desired their own place of worship in the antebellum period, before slavery was declared over, before the Civil War. And out of this came the present day First Baptist Church of Capitol Hill, and it later spawned the Spruce Street Baptist Church. In 1865 and 1866, African Methodist Episcopal clergy came into Nashville. And one of them, Jordan Winston Early, commented in 1866 that he met a number of African Americans who had drawn off from whites and sought to establish their own churches. One of the churches that Jordan Winston Early shepherded was the St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. All of these congregations derived from earlier efforts in the antebellum period on the part of African Americans to seek out their own worship spaces where they had the opportunity to set up the framework and foundation for independent Black churches that would come to full fruition in the postbellum period.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dickerson. So many of these early churches started in congregations that were established by white residents and left of their own free will. They weren't forced out, they chose to start their own.
That's right, this independent spirit, this desire for autonomy was present among African Americans long before the Civil War began. And these persons insisted on having their separate worship sites where they could pursue their spirituality in a way that was consistent with their own culture and their own tastes.
Okay. By far, most African Americans in that era lived in rural areas. And so there were many rural Black churches that survive today and are still, that were key to the development of African American communities. Dr. Van West, you've spent a lot of time studying rural churches in Tennessee and throughout this region. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about some of those early churches.
Well, what I've learned is it's such a privilege to work with the congregations of the rural churches on their preservation and extending their stories into the future. One of the most interesting ones in the Nashville area is over in Old Hickory. It's on the Wilson County side of Old Hickory, and it's Williamson Chapel, CME Church. And this church began with an enslaved man named Richard Williamson asking his owner for the right to create a church in the 1850s. And by the 1850s, they were meeting in a brush arbor or something similar to that. And from that spot on that land today, it's still a modern church, as well as the historic church building from 1916. So just like Dr. Dickerson talked about, enslaved people argued for, asked for, and then built on their own first churches out there in communities and places across the South. Another good example of one is really right upon emancipation. As African Americans were emancipated by federal occupation during the Civil War, you see a plethora of churches being established across the South, but particularly in Tennessee. Again, a really powerful story is of Reverend Matt Gardner, who was an enslaved man in Giles County, south of Pulaski. And upon emancipation, he and others quickly established the St. Elizabeth Primitive Baptist Church, and then started to build a community. They wanted their own cemeteries, they wanted their own schools. And even in the sort of cotton belt of Tennessee, over in West Tennessee, in places like Nutbush, Tennessee, you can find that same story repeated. Reverend Hardin Smith established the Woodlawn Baptist Church and Cemetery right at emancipation, and it became just a powerful mother church for other Baptist churches to be established throughout that part of West Tennessee over the next generations. So these are places of community formation. They're safe havens for African Americans to practice their faith as a community, but also to start educating themselves. And they're so important in so many different ways.
All right, thank you, Dr. West. And we're going to talk some more about that because it's important for the churches who have that history to document that history and be registered with the National Registry of Historic Places. And we'll have more information on that in a bit. But I want to turn now to Dr. Cummings and the topic of women in church leadership. There were some struggles with that. Early on, as mentioned in the video clips. And here we are more than 150 years later, and still someone like you is in a very unique position as a woman in church leadership. So what was the role of women locally in the early Black churches that were here in Middle Tennessee? And how have those challenges changed over the years?
So the history of the Black church is indeed remarkable, and women have had a long and intricate history with the church. But I want to go back even a little further because as far back as African American history begins, during a time when their bodies were bound by the violence of slavery, Black women gathered together in communion with God. Long before churches were even organized. And yet while Black women have been the neck bone of the church, speaking words of wisdom and leading the church in sacred music, while they've been the hand bone serving in the church and tending to the sick, the backbone, giving their finances out of their hard-earned money, washing and ironing for white women, the knee bone of the church, storming the gates of heaven through the prayers. These same women from the beginning found themselves suppressed and oppressed by the very church where they found freedom and liberation. And as Dr. Henry Louis Gates says, even forgotten in recorded history. Thus, while the Black church has played a vital role in Black liberation since its beginning, it's not been liberating for women. And so the struggle is real and the struggle continues. You heard in the video that women make up 70 to 90% of Black congregations, and yet male leadership makes up 90, 95%. And that continues today. The struggle is real. Black women struggled in the church then, and Black women struggle in the church now. But women in the church, Black women in the church, understand that we stand on the shoulders of some women who have come before us in the early 1800s. And you heard in the video them mention a few, but I'd just like to highlight a few other women, Jarena Lee, that so many are familiar with in the AME church, who just surpassed all kinds of gender expectations and was one who just gave courage to so many women. Sojourner Truth, who was preaching and teaching, did not even need to be ordained. You know, her famous address, "Ain't I a Woman?" In my own tradition, Baptist tradition, Nannie Helen Burroughs, I'm so proud to be named an award, given an award by her name by the American Baptist College here in Nashville. She's was such a strategic woman in organizing women, organizing their voice, organizing the purse. She understood the power of the purse. She was an activist, a feminist, a businesswoman. And then in my tradition now, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we just ordained elected our first president, General Minister and President, Reverend Teresa Howard Owens. And so while the doors are open for some, there's still those hurdles and those battles that we have, that we continue to fight. There are more women in seminary, more women being trained, and yet those doors remain closed. And I think that even when the Black church separated themselves from the white church, that they bought over so much of the white church patriarchy. And that's what we see, and that's part of that battle and the struggle that we still face.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cummings. And you certainly are a trailblazer and leading the way for women in church leadership. I want to turn to Dr. Lewis. We saw the Freedom Singers in the segment about the civil rights movement. Of course, long before the Freedom Singers, we here in Nashville and people all over the world know about the Fisk Jubilee Singers and perhaps others who played significant roles in helping to support the church and institutions, music being so vital to the sustenance and success of the Black church. How did the music of groups like the Jubilee Singers and even music before their time from enslaved people impact and support early Black religion?
Sure. So the development of the as a distinctive body of African American sacred song really parallels the development of this kind of distinctive form of African American Christianity, which Dr. Dickerson and Dr. West had outlined a little bit earlier, right? And so there's a development of this distinctive way of worshiping that, like the African American Christianity in general, meets the needs of enslaved people, for a sense of dignity, for a sense of affirmation of their humanity. And so the earliest written descriptions of the spirituals, or of what we can assume were spirituals, date from the 1810s and 1820s. And they're from the same period when the first independent Black churches and denominations, such as the AME Church, are really flourishing around the country. And that applies to Tennessee as well as around the South. And so by the early 19th century, Black people in America have taken European hymns and psalms and refashioned them into distinctively African American expressions by combining European music from white churches with African-derived techniques like improvisation, like rhythmic syncopation, like pentatonic scales, column response singing, these things that we now see as essential elements of African American religious music. And so one example, the earliest published collection of hymns by an African American author was put out by Richard Allen in 1801. And in that collection, there's a device called a wandering refrain, which to put it briefly is, a few lines that could be added basically to any hymn. So it's a refrain that you can kind of add into a song at various points. And what this suggests is that, already by the early 19th century, you have elements of improvisation, you have a less formal way of worship that is already making a distinction between the African American church and the white churches. I mean, significantly, you don't have this musical device in hymn books that are published and used in white churches. And that's a fundamental difference that tells us something about the early development of Black religious music. And then we know from eyewitness descriptions around the South, including in Tennessee, that music and specifically singing is a fundamental aspect of religious worship in African American communities from the very earliest point that you have these descriptions of independent Black congregations. And so by the time you get the Fisk Jubilee Singers in the late 1860s and the early 1870s, they're operating within a very well-established tradition of the African American spiritual and of African American religious music. What they are able to do that's so significant is that not only do they, of course, work on their craft so that they can perform these songs at a very high level, but they then take this music that had been a music of the African American community, a music that was very carefully protected within the African American community, and make the whole world aware of it. Right. So the Fisk Jubilee Singers tours around the country and then ultimately around Europe, and then ultimately after that around Asia and the rest of the world, are really the first time that people outside of the Black community are introduced to African American music, sacred or secular. And so it's enormously significant. And again, that's their contribution.
Okay, thanks for explaining that to us. We're going to continue our discussion for a few more minutes before we return to the video, just for you who are participating at home to know there's a little bit more of the video that we're going to show in a moment. But someone has pointed out that while the docuseries focuses on the Protestant church, Black church, that there are other faith traditions that were very important in the Black community, even going back to the earliest times. And specifically mentioned was Catholicism and Islam, which of course was the first religion for many Africans who were brought over to this country for enslavement. What can you tell us about other faith traditions and their importance in the early history of Black Middle Tennesseans? And Dr. Dickerson, you want to take that?
During the period of the slave trade, which was inaugurated in the 17th century with regard to the transport of Africans to what became the United States, African slaves brought with them three religions. One religion was the variety and diversity of their native African spiritualities. The other was Islam, because many parts of West Africa from which these slaves derived had already been for centuries practitioners of Islam. Also, many Africans brought Christianity, particularly Catholicism. In fact, if one, and let's say, just pick randomly a year like 1800, if one just looked at Black religion hemispherically, that is not only the United States, but also Central and South America and the Caribbean, Protestantism would have been a minority religion. The overwhelming majority of Africans would have been Catholic. As a matter of fact, Catholicism was so important to African-American slaves. For example, in 1739 was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, in which a group of slaves planned a slave insurrection in the Charleston area and designed their rebellion to take slaves from, freed slaves from South Carolina through Georgia to march through to Florida. These slaves, many of them, many scholars argue, had come to the South Carolina colony as Catholics, and in fact, designed their rebellion or timed their rebellion according to the Marian calendar. That is the date on the Catholic calendar when Gabriel announced to Mary that she would give birth to Jesus, the Annunciation, and that they planned that rebellion in accordance with that Catholic calendar. So Catholicism, for example, was as much a part and as much as an instrument, a religious instrument for African-American resistance and rebellion as was Protestantism. There were a number of Africans who continued to practice their Islamic faith throughout slavery, directing their prayers toward Mecca. With regard to African religions, there is a plethora of evidence to demonstrate that African-American religious practices, as well as African-American burial practices, were derived directly from their African spiritual roots. For example, many African slaves placed instruments of cooking utensils and other kinds of utensils on the graves of the deceased, believing that they needed these instruments whenever they transferred from this world to the next. So there's a great variety, there's great religious variety in the slave background. Let me add one other thing. Not only were African-American slaves in the antebellum period Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian and Episcopal, but there were a variety of other denominations represented in the antebellum period. For example, if one is in Nashville, one will see a large number of churches of Christ. Many of those churches had derived from Black slaves who worshiped after the Stone Campbell movement and worship in Church of Christ congregations that began to form their own separate Black congregations in the post-Bellum period. There are Lutherans, there's enormous denominational and religious variety among the African American slaves in the antebellum period, and their churches took blossom and their churches grew and developed in the postbellum period.
Wow, that was so interesting, Dr. Dickerson. Thanks. I mean, as someone commented in the comment section, they didn't know about the influence of Islam in the early days of African American enslavement in this country. So thanks for enlightening us about that. I want us to go back to the video, but just quickly, do any of our other panelists have anything to add to that quickly?
I would say that I'm sorry, Dr. Cummings.
You go ahead, Dr. Lewis.
I would just say, to the point that Dr. Dickerson made, you can also hear the influence of Islam in some elements of African American musical practice. In particular, I mean, the types of vocal improvisations, the melismas that are associated, of course, you can hear them in gospel music and also in Black secular music. There are scholars that argue that those types of ornamentation come from the call to prayer, which is fundamental to Islamic worship, and would have been very familiar to a lot of enslaved people coming from West Africa, where Islam was especially influential in places like
Dr. Lewis, are you referring to sort of the call and chant feature that many of us grew up with in the South?
More the type of solo vocal performance that someone in a minaret would perform to call people to prayer in a mosque, specifically. And the types of vocal ornamentation you hear there, you can also hear in, say, field hollers that are recorded, by people like Alan Lomax as late as the 1930s. So that's more what I'm talking about. So you can see there an influence of, in this case, Islamic worship that then becomes a fundamental part of Black Christian worship, interestingly.
When I was growing up, I think the older church folks used to call it lining a hymn. That's what I was referring to. I'm sure some people on this screening probably know that term, but that seems to be rooted in that as well.
Yeah.
Dr. Cummings?
I just want to add that while my work looked primarily at Black women in Black Baptist churches, that in all of the denominations that Dr. Dickerson mentioned, women struggled, right? And so even today, women in the Catholic Church are still trying to be ordained. But there were Black nuns, in each one of those denominations, women played a very prominent role, because we know that even in those denominations, 70 to 80 to 90% of the church is made up of women. And we talk about, if it wasn't for the women, that the church would really be struggling.
I wonder about something that was briefly mentioned in the video is, was there perhaps an opportunity for empowerment of Black men in a time, in an era when they were marginalized and they were disenfranchised and without power by the mainstream society and white society? And the church offered that. And is that why some of these gender differences kind of evolved and stuck around? Because it was the one institution where Black men could be empowered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the argument. And I'm sure Dr. Dickerson probably has more to say about it, but you're absolutely right. That was the one place where Black men, were able to feel that they had voice and ownership and agency. And so Black women doing what Black women do would step back. But there came a time when Black women said enough was enough, and that their voices were important too, and that they were able to add value. And so it's to those women that we pay homage even today for helping us find our voice and to find our way in the church. So yes, but you're absolutely right. That was the one institution where Black men have that agency and that empowerment.
Okay, I want to show some more of Dr. Gates' wonderful documentary. We have a few more minutes of clips to show you, and then stay around. We're going to discuss, these are some powerful scenes from the documentary. You don't want to miss this, and you don't want to miss our discussion immediately following the video. Stay tuned for that. Let's discuss some of what we just saw, those powerful segments about social justice movements. I want to ask our panel why it seems the Black church has been slow to embrace some contemporary social justice movements. The church was so courageous and took such a staunch position of leadership when it came to racial justice and civil rights, but has been less so with things like Black Lives Matter and women's rights and environmental rights and LGBTQ issues. What are the challenges and the hesitancies there? And is it important for the church to continue in that tradition of supporting social justice movements? Anyone? Dr. Cummings, I'm going to call on you because I know you have been very active in social issues and social circles in this community. What are your thoughts about that?
I have, and I'm so thankful and grateful to have pastored New Covenant Christian Church congregation for 10 years, who a justice-seeking congregation, not afraid to speak up and to speak out about issues of injustice across the life of our community. But, you know, I was thinking about when President Obama began to sing the song Amazing Grace. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, in the Black church, when that song is sung, the church goes up in praise. But that same amazing grace that we sing about, that we get so filled in our spirits with, that same grace we withhold from the least of these, women, our sibling who identify LGBTQ. And it's painful and it hurts. You know, I don't know why the Black church has been so slow to respond, except maybe to preserve a way of being that it has been such an identification continues with our white counterparts, the churches that we came out of. But I think it was Bishop Flunder that said, if the Black church does not become more welcoming and affirming, then we're going to lose the Black church. And I believe that to be true, because I believe that the God we serve is a God who is inclusive, who wants the wholeness of all people. And when we talk about civil rights, that's what we're talking about, bringing people to wholeness, right? But how can we say that we're this movement for civil rights, but not civil rights for all, not rights for all? And so my work has not been easy and it's not always been supported, but we do it because we know that it's what's right to do.
And, you know, I wonder about the comment that I think Dr. Gates made about closeted church members, and yet many who would probably be in that category are the church members that are so fundamental to the church. I think he said, you know, the ones that propped up the church, women and gay men in particular.
So you have women closeted who are too afraid to answer their call to ministry. You have gay people who are closeted who are too afraid to be their whole selves. And yet we're in this church that we love, and this church that we support, and this church that we know that without us would not be able to continue. And so our young people have lost so much respect for the church. And so when it says, where is the church with Black Lives Matter? I ask the same question, where is the church? You know, we look back on the civil rights movement, those were young people who were out there on the forefront of justice. Many of us are getting old. I just retired. We need young people to come behind us to continue to push, and we need to be there supporting them. And it needs to be the church. The church is the place where they should be able to find that support. So I too am just disheartened.
I wonder, oh, go ahead, Dr. Dickerson.
I think it's important to remember that the church historically has not been a monolith. Let me just cite a quick example, a familiar example. During the burgeoning civil rights movement in the 1950s and early 1960s, Dr. King had to leave his denomination, the National Baptist Convention, USA, because the president of that convention, Joseph H. Jackson, opposed Martin Luther King's civil rights activism. There are multiple theologies and there are multiple traditions within the Black church, some very conservative, even reactionary, unusually and unnecessarily sexist and homophobic. There are other segments of the Black church, sometimes across denominations, sometimes within denominations, that have a more expansive view of its liberationist legacy. I remember, if you allow an anecdote, I remember when women's consciousness flowered in the 1960s. And in my denomination and other denominations talked about the importance of women preachers. Where I grew up, I saw women preachers all over the place. I mean, that was not anything strange, unusual. It was quite normal. And so I was surprised that that wasn't the case in other denominations. I remember women clergy who founded churches. This is in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That part of the denomination in that region, women preachers were commonplace, encouraged, etc. It was not a paradise. That's not my point. My point is that there are a variety of traditions within the African American church, some very conservative. I remember Baptist churches that would not allow Methodists to receive communion. And they're in the same, my community had about 3,000 or 4,000 Black people. And there were Baptist churches that wouldn't allow a Methodist to come in and take communion. Had a different theology and identified according to those kinds of doctrinal strictures. I think we have to reclaim those parts of the tradition where there has been historically liberationist energy and mobilize it against those other parts of the tradition that are less liberatory.
Well, is someone else? Yes, I'm sorry, who's talking? Dr. Lewis?
This
Oh, Van, okay.
Yes, I would like to just share two thoughts to these very good comments. And first is historically, and this is from working with congregations in Selma, Birmingham, and Memphis on their civil rights stories. Not every church was gung-ho for the civil rights movement for a long time. Mm-hmm. There are some churches that were leaders from the 1920s forward. There were some who joined in 1962 or 1963 or maybe even later. So, congregations will react differently to the challenges of the day. And my second thought is, what is being said about the Black church could be said about churches in the United States in general. Don't we have an issue now within all of our churches of they advocating their leadership for civility, for voting rights, not just civil rights, and being open to all Americans in our country? To me, we have a democratic challenge now that churches need to be at the forefront in all churches. I agree with the comments here, but sometimes I am troubled when I hear from my white colleagues that, well, the Black churches aren't as aggressive as they used to be. Well, they need to look at their own before making that type of judgment.
That's an important comment, Van. Thank you so much for sharing that. In talking about, the differences among denominations and so forth, the Black church has been welcoming in general. And it's interesting that in hesitating to across the board maybe embrace some of these other more contemporary social justice issues. The sad story of Mother Emanuel Church was because that church was so open and welcoming to an individual who just walked in off the street and created, trauma and catastrophe for that church. So it's an interesting dichotomy, I think, that there's welcoming congregations like that, and sadly it led to disaster. And then there's also the other side of this issue where people are shut out, as was stated in the video. I think Sylvester was the one that the comment was made about him being, sort of shut out by the church. And Dr. Lewis, speaking of Sylvester, there is sort of the secular influence or the church influence on secular pop culture, in particular pop music. So, many of the traditions that might be ostracized in some denominations are embraced when people are in their secular lives, correct?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there has always been kind of a reciprocal relationship between the sacred and the secular within African American culture, because within many African cultures in West and Central Africa, there is not as rigid of a boundary between the sacred and the secular as we associate with, say, European cultures. And, an African American sacred music and African American secular music share a musical language that we associate with African American music in general. So things like blue notes, things like syncopation, things like call and response singing. You hear those characteristics in gospel singing, in congregational singing. You also hear them in the blues. You hear them in secular traditions as well. And so we see really early on, like very early in the history of Black religious music in America, that kind of ambiguity and blending between the sacred and the secular. Some of the earliest descriptions of African American sacred song describe Black congregations taking popular melodies, so taking melodies to popular songs of the day, and then adding religious lyrics to them, which, white observers at the time saw as sacrilegious, or at the very least very troubling, but which was kind of embraced as part of worship within Black congregations, most prominent of which would be Richard Allen's congregation in the early 19th century. And then in the early 20th century, you have musicians like Arizona Drains, the pianist in the Pentecostal church. You have Thomas Dorsey, the father of gospel music, taking elements of secular music, music like ragtime, music like the blues, music like jazz, and bringing those elements of that music into the church, into religious music. Thomas Dorsey actually was a blues musician at the beginning of his career. He was known as Georgia Tom. He played with Ma Rainey. And so again, all that he'd learned as a blues musician, first of all, he probably got a lot of that from the church in the first place. And then he brought a lot of that back into the church when he started writing gospel songs. And, there are a lot of examples. Another example, Mahalia Jackson, one of her biggest influences was Bessie Smith, which she says herself. She said that she would not sing secular music, but she was always very open about her admiration for Bessie Smith, her emulation of Bessie Smith's way of singing. And then, of course, in the late 60s, as in the documentary, you have the Edwin Hawkins singers Oh Happy Day, which is a crossover hit. But again, I guess what I'm saying is that's not that's like, at that point, Black people had been doing that for a few centuries.
Yes, and it continues. All you got to do is watch an episode of American Idol and see
Exactly,
everybody that says, I started singing in the church.
Right. You've got Kirk Franklin bringing hip hop into gospel music in the 90s. And like you just said, basically almost every African-American musician who has made a mark on American music had their earliest musical experiences in the church because of the church's importance as a community center. And as a place where, musically inclined people could learn about music sometimes for the first time. So the church has always kind of, again, there's this I think, openness to musical influence coming from a variety of sources that has been part of the Black church tradition for a long time. And that itself reflects, the African American and ultimately the African traditions, more generally speaking. So,
and the museum, the National Museum of African American Music, has a whole exhibit devoted to this, which goes to show how important it is. Devoted to African American religious music. Tell us just briefly about that. Now that you all just opened a few weeks ago, tell us a little bit about that exhibit.
Sure. So when you walk into the museum, the first gallery you enter, say if you're going kind of in order around our museum space, is an exhibition called Wade in the Water. Wade in the Water traces the history of African American religious music from its very earliest beginnings in pre-colonial Africa. So we talk about African traditions in not only ceremonies, but also ceremonial music. And then we talk about the conversion of Black people to Christianity in the mid-18th century. And then we talk about the distinctive forms of Black religious music that developed out of that kind of collision between these African traditions and these European religious music traditions that happens in North America. And so we go from those very earliest days of music all the way up to contemporary gospel music in the 21st century. And again, in doing so, we trace not only the development of the Black sacred tradition, but we also, touch on various points at which there was a crossover between the sacred and the secular. We talk about people like Thomas Dorsey. We talk about the Edwin Hawkins singers. We talk about the popularity of gospel groups like the Golden Gate Quartet, for example, who became very popular with just people who loved music beginning in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. So there's, in tracing the history of gospel music, you also see the way that the music has always had an appeal that actually extends beyond the church and has both served to welcome people into the church and has also just been, the music has also just been appreciated for its artistic qualities by people who are not religious. And that's another aspect we talk about. So we try to give a very kind of, a very comprehensive overview of the history of the tradition from its beginnings to the present, and also the way it's connected to other Black music traditions like the blues and jazz and hip hop.
Such an important part of African American history. And I hope those of you who are watching will make plans to visit the museum. You can link to their website in the speaker's information. As we get ready to wrap up this event, I just want to talk a little bit about moving forward. Some, even according to some of the comments in the chat, there is a belief by some that the Black church has suffered because of its handling of some of the contemporary issues that were mentioned in the last video clip. So how does the Black church create a counter narrative to violence, bigotry, ostracism, hate, to sort of return to a tradition of welcoming people from all walks of life, as was mentioned in the video? Can we just, go around, and I'd like to hear your comments about that briefly, each of you. Dr. Dickerson, why don't we start with you?
I just wanted to repeat what I said earlier, that there's a liberationist tradition that's available, embedded deep in the history of the African American church. The issues then were slavery and segregation, as well as colonialism, because many Black churches had outreach to the Caribbean and to Africa. The issues today are different. There are Black Lives Matter and the unspeakable violence perpetrated by law enforcement against young Black people. There's the LGBTQ issues. These are different issues, but the same liberationist tradition can be mobilized to address these issues of inclusion so that the Black church can remain faithful to that liberationist tradition that was hard fought and hard won.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis, it seems like music might be a great way to start. Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think one of the keys would be embracing that kind of open and welcoming spirit that is a part of the gospel music tradition and the Black sacred music tradition, and trying to apply that to other areas of the community outreach that the church does, and remembering that the spirituals are probably some of the oldest kind of expressions, kind of activist expressions that we have in American culture, generally speaking. These are people who were fighting against oppression and who were struggling for recognition, 2 centuries ago. And that those messages are still relevant today. And channeling that spirit in service of contemporary struggles is going to be very important.
Okay, thank you. Dr. West, your thoughts?
My thoughts would sort of just in 2 phrases. I think churches and too many of our institutions, they open their doors to be served. They should open their doors and go outside and be of service. As I liked when my friends and I talk about this, the motto, it's not about you, it's about them. Just that simple attitude change would help so many churches, I think, once again, find their mission and find their role in our society.
Reverend Cummings, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, and maybe you need to give us a benediction as we wrap up. But no, really, your thoughts about how other churches can learn from your experiences to change the counter narrative about these movements and embrace all people.
One of the thoughts that Dr. Dickerson raised was that the Black church is not monolithic, and no, it's not. However, the Black church is made up of oppressed people, and unfortunately, the oppressed have now become the oppressor. And I think too that yes, liberation theology needs to be embraced, but also a womanist theology, because a womanist theology talks about the survival of all people and embracing and being inclusive of all and leading all to a place of wholeness. I think that the music, certainly, if we're going to, if the Black church is going to survive, and we always talk about our children are the church of tomorrow. No, they're the church of today. And we need to embrace their music. If we're going to continue to move forward. I think that this could very well be the Black church's finest hour. I agree with Dr. West that the church must go outside of the four walls. The community is not coming into the church. The church has to go out to the community to serve the community. And when the church goes out to the community, it's not to, in a patriarchal way, to say, this is what you need to do. No, it's to listen and to walk alongside. And so I think that if the church does that, then the Black church that has always stood as a beacon of light in our community, the Black church has always been a haven of safety, the Black church that has always been welcoming to people, as we say, from all walks of life, unless we want to change you, we'll continue to be able to stand as that beacon. Great.
Thank you so much, Reverend Cummings. That's a great word, a message that we needed. And it's a good message to wrap up our discussion with. The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song docuseries will air in 2 parts on PBS here on Nashville Public Television, starting tomorrow night, Tuesday, with the second part on Wednesday night. You can learn more from our website at WNPT.org. I encourage you to watch this important work by Dr. Henry Louis Gates. Thank you all so much for joining us. And just a little bit of a teaser, Dr. Gates himself and his producer will be holding a Facebook Live event. That information is available in the chat panel if you want to hear his thoughts about the producing of this documentary. I'm LaTonya Turner, and I'm so glad you joined us for this discussion. Be safe and have a good night.